Good evening. Settle in. Let the darkness be a comforting blanket and allow your thoughts to drift. My name is Rowan Morgan, and for 30 years I was a detective in this small salt-sprayed town of Crescent Cove. My work is done now, but some stories never quite fade. They linger, like the scent of low tide on a summer evening. Tonight, I want to share one such story with you. A quiet case of knotted threads and patient secrets. A case closed, lights dimmed, exclusive. Let's begin. Chapter 1. Mailbag at the Lighthouse. The call came on a Tuesday in late autumn, the kind of day in Crescent Cove when the sky is the color of a gull's wing and the sea is calm and contemplative. I was in my small workshop, mending a fishing net, a pastime that keeps my hands busy and my mind still. The phone's ring was an unfamiliar interruption. It was the Historical Society down at the old Lighthouse. They were renovating the keeper's quarters, a place that had been sealed off since the light was automated back in the 80s. During the demolition of a false wall near the hearth, workers had found something tucked away in the insulation. A canvas mailbag, stiff with age and sea salt, stamped in faded red ink with the words, "Undelivered, Dead Letter Office." The date on the seal was October 19th, 1976. An hour later, the bag sat on my desk. It felt strangely heavy, not just with the weight of its contents, but with the weight of time itself. The coarse canvas was rough under my fingertips, and it smelled faintly of dust, brine, and old paper. The lead seal was still intact, clamped shut over the grommets. A name was written on the tag in careful, looped cursive. Silas Croft, Postmaster. Silas, a name I hadn't heard in years. He was a pillar of the old town, a man whose face was as familiar as the post office clock. He knew everyone's business, not because he was a gossip, but because he was the custodian of their connections, the silent witness to their joys and sorrows, all sealed under a 3-cent stamp. He passed away peacefully in the early 90s. Seeing his handwriting was like hearing a voice from a distant room. The year 1976 was what made the Historical Society call me. It was the year Nora Pike disappeared. Nora owned the Crooked Shelf, a little bookshop on the wharf that always smelled of paper, tea, and rain. She wasn't a native of the cove, but she had become a part of its quiet rhythm. She had a gentle way about her, a thoughtful silence that made people feel seen. She'd recommend a book not by its cover, but by what she sensed in your spirit. Then one evening, she was gone. The shop was locked, her coat was on its hook, and a pot of tea was left half-finished on her desk. There were no signs of a struggle, no witnesses, no note. Nora Pike simply vanished into the coastal fog. We worked the case for months. We interviewed everyone, traced every rumor, from whispers of a clandestine lover to darker theories of a kidnapping tied to a family debt back east. But every lead frayed into nothing. The town grieved, then slowly it forgot. The Crooked Shelf became a souvenir shop, and Nora's story became a piece of local folklore, a ghost story told to summer visitors. But for those of us who knew her, and for me, the detective on the case, it was a constant low hum of incompletion, a question left hanging in the air. Now, this mailbag, lost for nearly half a century, promised a new sentence in a story we all thought had ended. With a pair of wire cutters, I carefully snipped the lead seal. The canvas flaps fell open, and the scent of the past rose up to meet me, patient and preserved, ready at last to be heard.
Chapter 2: Stamps and Secrets. The contents of the mailbag weren't chaotic. They were neatly bundled, a small stack of perhaps a dozen letters, all addressed, stamped, and canceled. It was a time capsule from a single evening's work. I laid them out under the warm glow of my desk lamp, the light catching the varied textures of the paper. There were thin, almost translucent airmail envelopes, heavy cream-colored stationery, and a simple pale blue business envelope. Each one was a small, sealed world. My focus, however, went first to the stamps and the cancellations. In my line of work, you learn that the official marks on an object often tell a more truthful story than the object itself. The postmarks were all from Crescent Cove, all dated October 19th, 1976. That was the night Nora Pike was last seen. But it was the cancellation times that snagged my attention. They were stamped in military hours, as was standard. One was marked 1930, another 2100, a third 2245. This was unusual. The post office lobby closed to the public at 5 o'clock. Mail dropped in the outside box would be collected and postmarked the following morning. These letters, however, had been processed and canceled by hand late into the evening. This was Postmaster Silas Croft's work, done after hours, a quiet favor for someone. On a hunch, I pulled out my old tide tables for the North Atlantic coast, a thick blue book whose pages are soft with use. I flipped to October 1976. Crescent Cove has a dramatic tidal range, a fact that governs the lives of anyone who makes their living from the sea. High tide on the evening of October 19th was at 7:35 p.m., or 1935. Low tide was at 1:50 a.m. The cancellation times seemed to mirror the tidal chart. 1930, just before high tide, 2100, as the water began to recede, 2245, a point of significant outflow, when the currents running past the harbor mouth are at their strongest. It was a loose correlation, perhaps a coincidence, but in a case this cold, there are no coincidences. The next morning, I drove out to a small cottage on the edge of the salt marshes. This was where Martin Poole lived, the man who had been Silas Croft's apprentice back in the 70s. He was retired now, a quiet man with hands gnarled from a lifetime of sorting mail. I found him in his garden, tending his roses. We spoke for a while about Silas, about the methodical, almost ritualistic way he ran the post office. I asked Martin about after-hours work. He nodded slowly. Oh, Silas was always there late. He said the town's connections shouldn't have to wait until morning. Then I asked him about the postmaster's keys. His eyes became distant, lost in memory. He described a heavy brass ring holding more than 20 dozen keys. It was the town's skeleton key, he explained. Silas had master keys for the freight depots, the back gates at the fishing docks, even the service entrance to the old ferry terminal. It was an official arrangement for mail freight. He was the only one who could get a special delivery onto a cargo ship or a departing ferry in the middle of the night. He was a stickler for the rules, though. Every tea's use was logged, every single time. He used to say, "The logbook is the postmaster's conscience." That logbook, if it still existed, might be the key to everything.
Chapter 3. Letters Never Sent. Back in my study, with the sound of a distant foghorn rolling in from the bay, I finally turned my attention to the letters themselves. To open them felt like a transgression, a violation of a promise made between two people long ago. But they were evidence, silent witnesses that had been waiting patiently for their testimony to be heard. I handled each one with care, slitting the envelopes open with a thin silver letter opener my wife gave me from my retirement. The folded paper inside was crisp, preserved perfectly in the dark. I decided to read 3 of them, the ones that felt most significant. The first was from a man I remembered well, a fisherman named Alistair Finch, a good man who had fallen on hard times that year. His boat, the Sea Serpent, had needed a new engine, and he was deeply in debt. His letter was addressed to his brother in Boston. The prose was simple, direct, full of a quiet desperation. He wrote of the pressure, the constant worry that gnawed at him. He mentioned Nora Pike by name. "Nora at the bookshop lent me some money to keep the bank at bay," he wrote. "She said to pay it back when the fish were running again. I don't know what I'd have done without her kindness." This letter suggested a motive for foul play. Perhaps his debt was larger than he let on. But his tone wasn't one of malice. It was one of immense gratitude. It was a letter from a man burdened by debt, but also lifted by an act of unexpected grace. The second letter was different. It was on delicate cream-colored stationery, the ink a faded blue. The handwriting was elegant, precise. It was from Nora herself, addressed to a woman in a small town in Vermont. There was no sender's name, only the address of her bookshop on the back flap. The letter spoke of a quiet, budding hope. It was a love letter, but one of such gentle restraint that it read more like a poem. She wrote of shared walks on the beach at dusk, of conversations that lasted for hours, of finding a kindred spirit who understood her need for a peaceful life. I have begun to feel that a new chapter is possible, a quiet life, far from the sea and its ghosts. She never named the person, but it was clear she was planning to leave Crescent Cove not as an escape, but as a deliberate journey toward a new beginning. The third envelope was the pale blue business one. It was addressed to the harbor master at the port of St. John in Canada. The return address was listed as a maritime shipping company in Portland, Maine. Inside was a single sheet with typewritten text, a simple confirmation of a passenger booking on a freighter scheduled to leave the Crescent Cove deep-water dock late on the night of October 19th. The name on the booking was Helen Pike, a slight alteration of Nora's full name, Eleanor. But something about the return address felt wrong. I knew the shipping companies that serviced our coast back then. This one wasn't familiar. A quick check of my old business directories confirmed it. The company address was a fabrication. It was a ghost, a false signpost. And if the return address was a lie, it meant someone was trying to create a false trail, to cover not a crime, but a carefully planned departure. Someone was helping Nora disappear.
Chapter 4. The Back Gate at Dock 3. The pieces were beginning to settle into a new configuration, like stones rearranging themselves at the turn of the tide. The old narrative of a sudden, violent abduction was dissolving, replaced by the outline of something far quieter and more complex. The tide tables, the after-hours postmarks, the letters breathing with secrets. They all pointed away from the town square and down toward the dark, murmuring world of the waterfront, specifically toward Dock 3. Unlike the main passenger terminal, Dock 3 was for freight and cargo. It was a place of work, smelling of diesel, rust, and damp rope. It was functional, unromantic, and, after the last shift ended, securely locked. I could picture the evening of October 19, 1976, as if I were standing there in the mist. The air would have been heavy with salt, the sky a deep, starless black. The only sounds would be the rhythmic slap of water against the pilings and the lonely cry of a gull. The main gates to the dock would be chained and padlocked, but a person with the right key could bypass them. Postmaster Silas Croft's keyring, the one his apprentice Martin described as the town's skeleton key, would have included a key for the small, unassuming back gate, the one used for late-night mail freight transfers. It opened onto a narrow, cobbled alley behind the fish processing plant. It was a discreet entrance, invisible from the main street. The postmark for 2245, nearly 11 o'clock at night, on the letter confirming passage on the freighter, suddenly made perfect sense. It wasn't just a random time, it was a signal. It marked the final step in a carefully orchestrated plan. Nora would have closed her shop at the usual time, leaving her coat and the half-finished pot of tea as a subtle misdirection, a scene for the town to discover and interpret as they would. She wouldn't have carried a suitcase. That would have drawn attention. Her belongings would have been sent ahead or packed in simple crates, loaded as freight. she would have walked through the quiet, sleeping streets of Crescent Cove, a ghost even before she was gone, heading not for her home, but for the dark alley behind Dock 3. There, under the single dim bulb that lit the back gate, someone would have been waiting for her. Someone with the postmaster's key. They would have unlocked the gate, let her slip through into the secure world of the docks, and locked it again behind her. Her supposed kidnapping wasn't a crime of violence, but an act of liberation. The rumors that we chased for months were nothing more than a smokescreen, perhaps even one she herself had quietly encouraged to ensure no one would come looking for her. She wasn't taken from Crescent Cove against her will. She was escorted, helped on her way by a trusted friend who had access to the town's hidden pathways and the authority to move in the hours when the rest of the world was asleep. The key wasn't used for a crime, but for an escape into a safer, more peaceful existence.
Chapter 5. Custody of the Keys. The entire case now hinged on a single, tangible object, that brass ring of keys, and more importantly, the logbook that recorded their use. My next call was to the Regional Postal Archive, a place where the forgotten paperwork of 100 small-town post offices goes to rest. I wasn't optimistic. Paper records from the 70s are notoriously difficult to locate. But sometimes the universe conspires to preserve the things that matter. 3 days later, a dusty, leather-bound ledger arrived by courier. The cover was embossed with the words, "Crescent Cove Post Office, After Hours Freight and Access Log, 1970-1982. My heart beat a little faster. Inside, page after page was filled with Silas Croft's meticulous, elegant script. I felt a profound sense of respect as I turned the brittle pages. Silas had logged everything. 21:30, 12 July 1974. Key D4. Unlocked Depot 2 for late medicine shipment. 02:08 March 1975. Key F1, ferry terminal access for emergency mail transfer, the Albatross. His life was written in these entries, a story of quiet, dutiful service. I turned to the section for October 1976. My finger traced the dates, entry by entry. Then I found it. The entry for October 19th. It was as clear and precise as every other. 1930, it began, matching the first postmark. Key B2, bookshop back door, secured premises at owner's request. This was the first piece of the puzzle. Silas had gone to the crooked shelf that evening, likely after Nora had already left for the docks. He locked the shop for her, leaving the scene exactly as she wanted it, creating the illusion that she had just stepped out. The second entry was timed at 22:45, matching the final crucial postmark on the letter to Canada. Key D3, Dock 3 Freight Gate, assisted with passenger boarding, freighter North Star, personal effects logged as postal freight. The final entry, logged just after midnight, read, "All keys returned to secure locker. Shift complete." It wasn't a villain who held the keys that night. It wasn't a kidnapper or a conspirator in the criminal sense. It was the Postmaster. Silas Croft, the most trusted man in Crescent Cove. He hadn't broken the rules. He used them to perform the ultimate act of service. He used his official access to help a friend find safe passage. He used the postal system itself, the stamps, the cancellation marks, the freight manifests, as a set of coded instructions, a map hidden in plain sight. The forged return address on the booking confirmation was a simple, clever way to ensure the letter would eventually be declared undeliverable and end up back in his hands, not out in the world where it could be traced. He gathered all the correspondence related to her departure, bundled it together, and sealed it in a mailbag. A final, tidy piece of administration. Why he hid it in the lighthouse, we'll never know for sure. Perhaps it was the safest place he could think of, a beacon of light where a secret could be kept safe until it was time to be found.
Chapter 6. Deliveries. Belated. In the end, there was no dramatic confrontation, no confession drawn out under a harsh light. The only person whose actions needed explaining had been gone for 30 years. My final report was less of an accusation than a story. I laid out the evidence, piece by quiet piece. The mailbag found in the lighthouse, the letters of debt and love, the postmarks that aligned with the evening tide, and the final irrefutable proof in Silas Croft's own elegant handwriting in the dusty logbook. I posited that Nora Pike was not the victim of a crime, but the recipient of a profound act of friendship. She had been quietly and methodically helped to disappear, to start a new life she desperately wanted, far from the ghosts she mentioned in her letter. The file was officially closed. The cause of her disappearance was reclassified from unknown presumed foul play to simply case closed. My work, however, felt incomplete. The letters, those small, sealed worlds of hope and worry, were still undelivered. They were addressed to people, not to a case file. Over the next few weeks, I undertook one last task. I found Alistair Finch's brother, a retired carpenter living in Boston. I sent him the letter his brother had written all those years ago. He called me, his voice thick with emotion, telling me he never knew how close Alistair had come to losing everything, or of the quiet kindness Nora Pike had shown him. The letter to the harbor master in Canada was a dead end, its purpose already served. But the third letter, the most personal one, was Nora's. It was addressed to a woman in Vermont. A little research, a few calls, and I found her. She was in her late 70s, a retired librarian living in the same small town. Her name was Helen. Nora had taken her friend's name for her new life. I drove up there on a clear, cool day, the leaves just beginning to turn. I met her in a small cafe. I simply handed her the letter, explaining where it had been found. She read it with tears in her eyes, a lifetime of questions answered in that faded blue ink. Nora, she told me, had lived a quiet, happy life with her. She had passed away 5 years earlier from an illness, peacefully, surrounded by books and love. She had found her new chapter. Back home in Crescent Cove, I sometimes walk down by the wharf at dusk, when the lights of the town begin to glow against the deepening twilight. The mystery of Nora Pike is solved. There was no monster, only a helper. There was no violence, only a quiet, compassionate conspiracy. Some rescues don't involve sirens and flashing lights. They happen silently in the space between a postmark and a tide table, with a key turning softly in a lock. The case is closed. The deliveries, though belated, are finally complete. And now, it's time for you to rest. Let the quiet of the cove settle over you. Good night. Fictional Dramatization 2025. Case closed. Lights dimmed.